Good morning, Colin, and thank you very much for giving your time to the Mint magazine.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much indeed, Henry, for inviting me to do this.
It's great. Actually, you are a serial interviewee now because you've previously been interviewed. So it'll be interesting to sort of compare and contrast, because it was about 5-6 years ago, wasn't it?
Yes.
A fair time, a fair time. So you're about to publish this great book, Capitalism and Crisis. So I just wondered if you could start by describing your key idea of the moral law and what significance it has.
Okay, put very simply, the moral law that I'm putting forward is that one should not profit at the expense of others. And by that I mean profit derives from the Latin profectus and proficere, to advance and progress. And my view is that profit should be related to exactly that, advancement and progress. It shouldn't be related to regress and imposition of detriment. And so what I'm putting forward is the notion that one should reconsider the nature of what a profit is, namely that a profit should not derive for imposing detriment on others. And I put this forward from a consideration of one of the most fundamental ethical principles in modern civilization, and that is the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule, as put forward by Confucius originally, was a notion of one should not do unto others what you do not wish them to do to you. And that was translated into a modern equivalent of do unto others as you would be done unto you. Now, my view is that actually that notion of the Golden Rule needs to be reformulated. The problem with it is it's essentially self-referential. It's looking at the interests of others through one's own eyes, rather than thinking about what is it that others really wish to have done to them.
Yes.
So the reformulated notion of the Golden Rule, which I'm putting forward, is do unto others as they would be done unto them. And the negative connotation of that is do not do unto others what
Yeah.
do not wish to have done unto them. And that's how I come at this notion of what a profit is, that a profit should derive from doing unto others what they wish to be done unto them, not what they do not want to be done unto them. And so I think it's got a substantive moral underpinning, but I think translated into the modern world, it has some fundamental implications about the way in which we run our capitalist system.
And so businesses would have duty only to make profit where they're not causing detriment. They're actually solving practical problems.
Yes, and that's how I put it forward in terms of the notion of the purpose of the business as being about solving problems of others. And that's what I think is, in essence, the reason why we created business and the corporation in the first place, to solve problems of other people. And in doing that, companies should ensure that they are not at the same time inflicting detriment or harm on other people, and they should incur the costs of avoiding that happening, and where it does happen, to rectify or remedy the harm that is done to other people. And I describe that as being a true cost, a cost that reflects not just the input costs into the production process, but also the cost of remedying or avoiding detriment to others. And from a true profit, from a true cost, I think one can derive what I term a just profit or a fair profit. That is net of the true cost of the business. And I think that this is fundamentally important because directors of the companies are required to sign off their accounts as being a true and fair representation of the financial position of the business. And at the moment, I don't think that they are either true or fair. They're not true in the sense of reflecting the true costs of remedying or avoiding detriments. And they're therefore not fair in the sense of my notion of a just profit in reflecting the profit net of the true costs. And I think it's vital that they should be a true and fair representation.
So I just want to explore a bit more this notion of solving problems, which presumably feels to me a bit akin to sort of meeting needs or providing something that people want or need or something like that. Now, one of the issues I would think there is that if you take the sort of thinking about what business has done, if you like, from one perspective of actually creating needs or making people feel inadequate in some way. And I'm sure you're aware of the great Edward Bernays, who wrote eloquently about the problem that businesses faced is that people don't need anything. So we actually have to put a lot into marketing, sales budgets, etc., to make people feel as if they have got problems which need solutions. And Tim Jackson's written a lot about this. One of the roles of the businesses or capitalism is to make you feel in some way lacking, that you are inadequate in some way and have a problem, so that it needs to be solved. How do you deal with that in your framework?
That gets to the heart of an issue as to what does one actually mean by problem solving. And the notion of problem solving that I have in mind is that companies actually identify what the problems of the people with whom they interact as customers or suppliers or communities really are. And that the role that marketing can and should be playing in this context is not doing what you're talking about in the sense of creating a belief of inadequacy on the part of individuals or communities, but exactly the opposite, recognizing that there are problems that are really inherent to those with whom they interact, and that should really be the basis of the problems that companies are seeking to solve. But it's not just about meeting people's needs. People's desires are important, and the notion of problem solving is not just one of looking for difficulties and solving them, but also understanding what is it that people aspire to do in a real sense. And that means identifying both the increment that companies can have in terms of enhancing the well-being of others, and also the avoidance of a sense of deficiency that people might genuinely have because of the conditions that they currently face. Now that's important because it's not just a matter of companies looking to solve existing issues that we as individuals or communities face, but to recognize that we're progressing. And so if you think, for example, about the technological innovations that have occurred, those have been solving problems, but problems that we hadn't really identified before that could be solved. So the notion of innovation and invention is very important in this regard in terms of enhancing the well-being of others, not by making them feel deficient, but by recognizing that the power of technology in particular to advance our well-being is immense. And that in the process of doing that, companies should really ensure that they are solving, not creating problems. And in too many cases, technological advances inflict a significant degree of problem as well as solving problems. And that's really part of the notion of progress that I think does underlie profit. That this is, in essence, a process by which companies identify problems, or new ways of solving problems. And in the process, they then create other problems. And they have to think about solving those problems so that the world advances through identifying ways of solving problems, creating problems, solving those problems progressively. And that's what I really think should be underlying the objective that people who run and own companies and work for companies see as their mission and the purpose of their businesses.
I suppose then, on the face of it, given the huge inequalities in the world and the majority of people living in situations that are not great around the world, then if you were going to apply that, most of the effort of business would be solving the problems of people in so-called developing world or the global south or the majority world, and presumably most of the people who have all the wealth would have no real significant problems of any sort, and would have to hand over, there have to be some way of handing all of their resources to that majority world.
Well, you're absolutely right to focus on the relevance of this to solving problems amongst the most impoverished, lowest income communities around the world. And I'd slightly reverse the way in which you put that in terms of saying that at the moment, business is extremely heavily focused on the wealthier segments of the world. And to a large extent, ignores the plight of a vast proportion of the world's population. Now, what this is basically saying is that, in essence, some of the most significant and important challenges, and potentially the most profitable ones, are those that have been largely ignored to date, namely in some of the poorest regions in the world. And finding innovative ways of solving their problems is, I think, one of the major challenges that this notion of what problem-solving business is about really brings to the fore. And I want to illustrate it with an example of a company that has gone through this process of recognizing what its real purpose is, and in the process, not only help to resolve major problems in some of the most impoverished parts of the world, but also created incredible commercial value for itself. And it's the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk, which produces insulin. And it's a company that thought that its purpose was simply to produce and sell insulin at a profit. But then it realized that 80% of type 2 diabetes, which insulin is used to treat, is found in low and middle income countries, most of which could not afford its insulin. So it really thought its purpose and recognized that actually its real purpose was to help people treat type 2 diabetes, and even better, help them to avoid getting it in the first place through changing nutrition. And they worked with a lot of partners in government, in local authorities, in universities, in hospitals and doctors to identify the best forms of treatment and the changes in lifestyle and nutrition that might help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes. Now, that actually sounds as if the company is shooting itself in the foot by diminishing the demand for insulin if it finds alternative treatments and reduces the incidence of type 2 diabetes. But on the contrary, its business has boomed on the back of it. And you may know that Novo Nordisk is now the highest market capitalized company in Europe, having just overtaken LVMH.
Yes.
Why? Because in the process of discovering what its purpose is, it realized that a key element in terms of treating diabetes and helping people to avoid it is a matter of weight and reducing people's weight. So one of the products that emerged in the process of discovering its real purpose was a weight treatment drug, Wegovy, which is now a blockbuster, making Novo Nordisk an incredibly valuable company. And I think this illustrates how this innovative way of thinking about problem solving can be converted not only in terms of a major step forward in terms of addressing problems of some of the most impoverished parts of the world, but also creating immense value for companies' investors.
Can I just move on then? Because one of the things that really struck me about your book is your main focus on the corporation and reforming, I suppose, the shareholder dominated corporation. And I suppose that seemed to me to somewhat to be in tension with your sort of got the reform version of the Golden Rule, which particularly talks about the fact that people need their idea of their own needs is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of surprised that you sort of don't really, well, you dismiss or don't look into structures like cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, other structures that provide the basis for evening out the power and giving voice to people who normally don't get voice. Provide a basis for a more moral, because morality is what you're trying to put into organizations. And I would suggest morality is more likely to be in organizations where various perspectives are recommended, because then or voiced, so that it's less easy to go and exploit and damage one set of people. And all these possibility of different sorts of structures don't really get much of your attention, or if you do, you dismiss them as not a good idea. So why is that?
Okay, well, thank you for raising that, Henry. And let's say that I don't dismiss them at all, but you're right that the focus of the book is on, in essence, the conventional corporation, rather than the large number of alternative ownership structures that exist, for example, cooperatives, mutuals, social enterprises, etc. And that's not because I don't think them important, but for two reasons. One of which is I want to tackle head on the most complex case to address. Okay, the companies that are most motivated by purely, or what is seen to be at the moment, purely financial interest. Okay, and the second reason is that I believe that's an particularly important segment of the broader business structure, insofar as those are the companies that can mobilize the largest resources, financial resources, to, in principle, help solve our problems. And that the importance of the corporation as it's emerged over the last 200 years has been to combine the notion of management in the sense in which cooperatives and mutuals and whatever operate, with raising vast amounts of financial resources. And what I think we've really lost over that period of the emergence of the modern corporation is the first part of that. And that is the notion that those businesses emerge to solve problems and to raise financing in the process of doing that. And what I want to do is to say, well, can we tackle the problems that have emerged in relation to this institution that has created immense prosperity in one sense, but at the same time done immense damage to the environment, to inequality, etc. And therefore, I'm saying, well, can one get the merits and the benefits associated with mutuals, with cooperatives, with social enterprises, etc., but do it in a context where these vast amounts of financial resources can be devoted towards financing these activities. And so what I talk about is, in essence, introducing those elements of mutuality, of cooperatives within the way in which a traditional stock corporation is structured. And the way I talk about it is in terms of the governance and the leadership and the management of the business. Namely, what is distinctive about mutuals and cooperatives, etc., is their engagement with their communities, with their customers, with their suppliers, etc., so that there is a real understanding of the problems that need to be solved in a particular locality, in a particular community, which is something which is entirely lost from the hierarchical corporation as it's currently run. And so a key element of what I'm talking about is the reinvigoration of that notion of the mutuality of business, etc., within a joint corporation through finding a method of delegating decisions, delegating authority within an organization from the top, from the board, down to the shop floor, in terms of empowering people in those local communities within the largest multinational corporations to really take decisions and to interact with those in those communities in a form in which a mutual organization or a cooperative business might operate. So that is the challenge that I've been trying to solve.
Well, so moving on then to that specific point, one thing I suppose I was looking for in your book, which I'm not sure I saw quite, was what's sometimes called the theory of change. I know, I mean, towards the end, actually, you talk about how many crises are we going to need before anything changes. And obviously, you've proposed a radical change, and it might be argued that the reason why corporations get so much money is precisely because they are totally focused on profit, whoever else is damaged, etc. So you are proposing a deep and fundamental change in a system which is built around the power of people who are making all the money out of exploiting others and influence government, influence regulation, etc., etc., dominate the political system to a more or less greater extent. Maybe US is worse than here, but substantially here. So how seems to be a really big question. How can this change you're suggesting ever really happen?
Because it is something that is of interest or in the interest of those powerful, wealthy investors as much as it is in the interest of us, communities, societies, and the most impoverished parts of the world. It is very much an agenda which I think should appeal to the right of the Republican Party in the US as much as it does to the left of the Democratic Party. And the reason for that is that increasingly, as the right is recognizing, corporations are being subject to ever intensifying regulation. And if they think that it's got bad recently, they should recognize they've seen nothing yet, because what's going to be needed to address the multiple problems that are emerging from the way in which profit is currently being earned is going to require an immense degree of more regulation going forward to stop it. And it frankly won't succeed in stopping it, even if that regulation.
I've got it. Don't mind. I'm just going to sort of respond. So what I take it is you're saying that the theory of change is really enlightened self-interest, or the people who are currently benefit will see that actually they're part of the same planet. They're part of unless they change, things are going to get worse.
Well, it's not quite enlightened. It's that there's this real threat, and we've seen over the last 3 years the Business Roundtable responding to the threat of regulation coming in from Elizabeth Warren if she became the president of the US, they responded by saying, okay, we'll do it ourselves. Well, that is in essence self-interest, which reflects a real sense of risk of political change.
But if you look at major changes, I would suggest in history, there may be a certain amount of sort of enlightened self-interest from the elite on the edge, but haven't there always been sort of coalitions with the people who are actually suffering at the other end of the scale? The union movements that built and pushed safety for workers, all these sorts of things, so that workers weren't striking. It wasn't just self-interested enlightenment from the bosses, was it? It was actually strikes. It was about there was often violence and conflict.
Absolutely. And what I'm saying is that this does not only appeal to the right, it appeals to the left. Okay? Because this is the way in which one can really address social issues and environmental issues. And that to bring about the change that people are seeking, one has to recognize that the way in which companies are profiting at the moment is simply outrageous. We did not think that the notion of a profit could derive from inflicting massive detriment to a point where it becomes an existential threat to our entire future of humanity. Okay?
But I mean, we have a whole history of slavery, don't we, where people were making huge amounts of money out of treating people, degrading people, dehumanizing people, killing people. So
and that is
new.
Yeah, and that is a particularly interesting example to cite, because had my notion of the nature of a corporation existed during the period of the slave trade, it would have not permitted the existence of those companies. Why? Because they were profiting at the immense expense of a significant segment of humanity. Okay, and it illustrates very well how this concept that I'm putting forward can really address the most substantial problems in the world in a way which gets at the thing that really antagonizes us. We don't mind if people make money, earn profit, if they're really creating benefits for us. I mean, in many respects, we respect entrepreneurs who are doing really beneficial things for us. What we cannot tolerate, and what gave rise to so much annoyance and irritation after the financial crisis, was the recognition that people who would put our faith in the banking community had simply exploited us. And that is precisely what this book is seeking to address.
And they haven't really done much better since, have they? But just moving on, one theory of change that quite appeals to me is Matsukato's idea of missions, that obviously try to, I would suggest, inject moral purpose by sort of multi-stakeholder collaborations around innovation and reshaping the rules of the market so that the better players actually, who are part of the mission or reach the mission, are the ones that succeed. Does that appeal to you?
Absolutely. And the final chapter of the book, it's actually the penultimate chapter of the book, talks exactly about that. How one needs to forge partnerships between different players in the private sector, in the public sector, in civil society, to solve the major problems that we face. And that the great merit of what I'm putting forward in terms of what a profit is, namely it derives from solving, not creating problems, is it encourages those partnerships. Because in essence, what this is saying is, the purpose of a business is precisely aligned what public and social and philanthropic organizations are seeking to do, namely to solve major problems without inflicting detriments. And therefore, it's aligning the private interest in profit with what all those other organizations are seeking to do. And it creates, therefore, a very natural base for a partnership between them.
Last but not least, I was quite struck by one of the things you say that's highly relevant to the theme of the next issue, which is about the power of economic thinking. Is that one way you say something like that conventional thinking has been so misguided that it has, particularly in economics, business, and finance. Now, and particularly, you have a whole chapter on the disastrous performance in the UK, where, of course, conventional economic thinking is particularly powerful. So, would you lay a lot of or some of the, I suppose, blame for the situation we are now in at the door of the economics profession?
The answer is simply yes. That the economics profession has propagated a notion of the corporation, which was at one stage thought to derive from really sound underlying economic principles, namely that all that one needed was competitive markets, and that would align the interests of companies with us as societies. Now, underpinning that was firstly the notion that markets would be essentially perfectly competitive. And secondly, what we've also lost sight of is that Adam Smith, in initiating this idea, did so on the basis of not just the wealth of nations, but a theory of moral sentiments in which he put forward the notion that underpinning the functioning of markets was a strong moral preconception, and that was critical for markets to function effectively. What I am saying is exactly in line with the combined ideas that Adam Smith is putting forward, namely that in the absence of the moral law, far from competition encouraging runs to the top in terms of the promotion and alignment between the interests of companies and us as societies, it creates a run to the bottom, where in terms of equivalent of Gresham's law, good companies are driven out by the bad. And that is exactly the state to which we've got to because of a reliance on a notion of the operation of markets which simply isn't observed, namely perfectly competitive markets, and the fact that we've lost sight of Adam Smith's moral sentiment.
Well, that seems like a good point to end. So it's been a pleasure talking to you, Colin, and thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to seeing you soon around Oxford.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry, for doing this, and I greatly enjoyed the discussion.